Alrighty, so ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for joining in today. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you. My name is Gabriel Steinhardt, and this presentation is titled Won't Get Fooled Again. By the end of the session, you will be able to recognize and critically analyze contemporary product management trends in order for you to be able to make more informed, better career choices. So we start with the beginning, and the beginning for us is going to be the 1980s to 1990s startup culture in the United States, primarily from the West Coast in the United States, but not specifically the Silicon Valley area. Could also be the entire West Coast from Seattle, Washington, down to San Diego, California. And during that time, startups were essentially a one-man show. It was one individual who did everything. They were the engineers, they were the salespeople, the marketing people, they were the fundraiser, they were the manager, the executive. They did everything. Everything centered around these individuals. It was essentially a company that often had one particular product. And this kind of an approach is exemplified in these two individuals, Steve Jobs from Microsoft and Steve Jobs from Apple and Bill Gates from Microsoft, who did everything. They were engineers, they were the designers, they were the CEOs, the fundraisers, the salespeople, the marketing, and they also did something, perhaps they weren't aware of it, but something called product management. Now, I am going to a little bit divert over here to a topic, and then we're going to come back to those two individuals, Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. So I've identified 4 different approaches or versions, if you want to call them, of product management. I'm hearing background noises from people with the microphone open. Okay, good. So I've identified 4 different approaches to product management, and we're going to talk about one particular approach to product management, which is relevant to that particular period in time, which is the 1980s to 1990s startup culture in the United States. And that particular approach is called the generalization approach. And we're going to learn a little bit about the generalization approach through this gentleman over here and his story. So this is Ben Horowitz. He was born in England, raised in California. He studied computer science at UCLA and Columbia. He was employed as an engineer in Silicon Graphics. Then he was a product marketing manager at Lotus, which was a large company at the time. And in 1995, he was hired as a project manager for a company called Netscape. And Netscape is known for producing the first internet browser. It was called the Netscape Navigator. And 2 years later, in 1997, Mr. Horowitz over here was promoted to be a vice president at Netscape. And in 1997, he wrote a memo, a note, which was titled Good Product Manager, Bad Product Manager. And in this note, he noted that a good, and this is the quote, a good product manager is the CEO of the product. And this is the approach that was prevalent at the time in the United States during the 80s and 90s, that the product manager was like the CEO of the product. It was essentially like these two individuals over here, who were the CEO of their particular product. They were the CEO of the startup, but they were CEO of a product, which was the only product or the main product that the company had. So let's go and talk a little bit more about the generalization approach. The generalization approach views product management as being multidisciplinary, multifaceted. The product manager is responsible for nearly everything and anything related to the product, just like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates were responsible for their particular products. The main consideration with the generalization approach is that the main consideration with the generalization approach is that product management is a generalization, not a specialization. And that is why people look at this approach as encompassing a multitude of different responsibilities that could be modified or added or subtracted. That is, it's shifting responsibilities. Now, the problem with the generalization approach is that we don't have any mechanism or rules or guidelines to decide upon the boundaries, the scope of responsibilities under the generalization approach. Almost anything related to the product could be fit in. There's nothing for us to judge if something is going to be included or excluded from the scope of responsibilities. Now, a CEO usually tells people what to do, and the expectation over here with the CEO of the product is that the product manager would tell other departments what to do in order for them to work together to bring a product into market. But you're not really a CEO. You don't have authority over those people. So there's constant and endless deliberations with regard to the generalization approach on ownership, responsibility, and how to lead without authority. Let's go and talk about the 4 different approaches in product management, which I had identified. And we're going to see the context of these later on as we progress in this presentation. So first, the generalization approach, which is the product manager does everything, CEO of the product, is something that was prevalent during the 1980s and 90s in the United States, primarily on the West Coast. But it kind of flowed from there towards the entire United States and elsewhere as well. The technology approach to product management emerged in the early 2000s, and it emerged particularly in the software industry. And there, the product manager was a technical person who was really a part of product development and subservient to the software development method being used by or selected by the engineers. So that meant that if the engineers were using waterfall or stage gate or milestone based or anything that they chose, that would impact and define or redefine the role of a product manager. And if they moved to Scrum or Agile or SAFe or DAD or whatever, that would redefine again the role of product management. And that creates some issues with regard to what is product management and what is the identity of a product manager. There are other approaches, such as the business approach, in which the product manager is really not doing product management. They're a business manager. I often saw this on the East Coast of the United States, also in Europe, in parts of Asia. This is in companies where the product is primarily a commodity, like cellular services or internet services. There, the product manager is really focused on all the monetary aspects of the business: pricing, budgeting, costing, profit and loss. And if there's a major product that is associated with the company, the product manager would also be responsible for P&L, profit and loss, and for the stock price. Now, the 4th approach is going to be called the methodology approach, and it is a way of thinking where product management is governed by some kind of foundation rules, like in the PMTK methodology. So to sum it up, presently there is not 1, but 4 different approaches to product management, which means that any discussion or assertion we make with regard to product management has to be framed in the context of a particular approach, because that assertion could be correct or incorrect depending on the particular approach. Now, the first 3 approaches, the generalization, technology, and business approaches, are unsupported and they can be invalidated. But they do exist, and all of these approaches do exist in the market, and companies do apply them, and there are job openings that embody these different approaches. So when you see a job opening in product management, it often will fall into one of these particular approaches or a mixture of them. So the generalization approach and all these 4 different approaches, which were evolving over time, created an identity crisis in product management. And what is a product manager and what is the scope of responsibilities? Actually, over the last 20 years, from the early 2000s, the product management domain has become an increasingly chaotic domain. It's a mess, slightly. So in the early 2000s, revolving around the year 2001, 2 streams kind of emerged. Now you can call them streams or forces or movements, whatever you want. I'm going to call them streams. So we had 2 opposing streams emerging in the early 2000s, trying to shape and define product management. Now, the first stream, I'm going to call it subject matter consolidation, and I was and am a part of this particular stream. And I will describe this stream through my journey, my personal journey in product management, the PMTK methodology which I developed, and some of the product management books that I wrote. The other stream, which I named RRR Marketing, is a type of an approach that is characterized by a very distinct marketing method or approach, a business model, and it runs completely opposite. It runs contradictory to my and other people's efforts in product management in the subject matter consolidation approach. So let's talk about subject matter consolidation. And the first thing we need to do is define it. So subject matter consolidation is the process to properly define and structure the product management body of knowledge. It's an attempt to thoroughly explain product management and provide answers to all questions in product management. And for me, at least, and for some other people, it started all in about 2001. And we'll go here for a bit of history. So the 2001 was the good old days. It was the peak of the dot-com bubble. And I was in the United States working for different startups at the time. And there was just unimaginable spending. There was humongous budgets, something that is unfathomable these days. But there was tons of money, humongous amounts of money. And there were startups being created every day, every week. And there was, of course, because of that, great demand for talent. And there were more jobs available than there were applicants. And that, of course, made sure that anybody who wanted to work could find a job. And also, the salaries were extremely high at the time. And I was working for different startups, and I was working in product management. And I started to read books about product management to educate myself. And at the time, the more prevalent books, one of them at least, was The Product Manager's Handbook by a lady called Linda Gorschelis. And it's now, by the way, in its 4th edition. So I read a lot of books, and I went to training sessions. I took all kinds of courses. And I went to all kinds of interviews. There were people asking you to come to interview all the time for product management jobs. But the more I read, the more I went to courses, and the more I got interviewed, the more confused I became. Because all the books and all the courses and all the questions being asked during the interviews were viewing product management differently. They were defining and expecting something of product management in a different way than each other. So it was very confusing, and in my belief at the time, people were just confused about product management. But the good old days came to an end. The peak of the dot-com bubble was in 2001. Everybody got laid off. The investors pulled out their money. There were no jobs at all at the time. So it was winter time, and I decided to go skiing, and I skied a lot, and I was skiing with a group of people, and every time that we went skiing, we used to go back and after the skiing and go to an Italian restaurant. And during one of those evenings, the person sitting next to me, we're talking about product management, and I said that, listen, product management is just a giant mess. All those books I've been reading and all those courses and all those interviews, everybody's confused about product management. They don't know how to define, explain, describe, organizationally place product management. And this confusion is driving me to search for the very basics of product management. Essentially, probably should start with the question which is, what is product management? So the person I was talking with said, what are you going to bring that others have not done? That is, why you think you're going to be different than others? And I said, well, this is like the Rorschach inkblot test. Hermann Rorschach was a Swiss psychologist who invented a psychoanalysis test where people look at these symmetrical inkblot patterns, and they're supposed to project upon that this scheme, this diagram, their own personal interpretation. And I said, product management is like the Rorschach test. It looks chaotic, but I think I can see some patterns, and I can see through all the mess, I can see some clarity over here. So I decided to buy a domain called Blackblot, and it was taken already. So I took the blackblot.com domain. Now, so I started to think about product management. Could somebody please turn off your microphone? I'm hearing background noises. I apologize. So I revert now to a gentleman called Randy Pausch, an American educator, a professor of computer science, teaching at Carnegie Mellon. And in one of his presentations, in one of his lectures, he said the following: fundamentals, fundamentals, fundamentals. You've got to have the fundamentals right. You've got to have them down first. Otherwise, all the things that you want to build upon the fundamentals, it's just not going to work. So I thought to myself at the time, what am I going to build? A product management model, method, framework, methodology? They're all different. Eventually, I created all of them, but I focused on a methodology. And when you're building a methodology, it has to be holistic, which means it has to cover the entire subject matter. It needs to be consistent, so there's no internal contradictions. And it has to have a theoretical component, but it must have a practical component. So I said to myself, I'm going to start with foundation rules, just like Newton's laws of motion. Then I will start with the product management foundation rules. And it took me actually 3 years to accomplish that, to develop the theory and the models and the methods and everything around it. And the bottom line is that these are the PMTK foundation rules, which identify and explain the very basic principles the Blackblot PMTK methodology is built upon. So the first one is that product management is comprised of product planning and product marketing, and that product management resides in the problem space. And I was trying to do subject matter consolidation to provide answers to the entire product management domain. So after some years, I wrote the first edition of the PMTK book, and then the second edition of the PMTK book, and then I wrote another book on product pricing. And then there was a certification program and a training program. And we also hired a lady psychometrician from London to do psychometric tests for product managers. And I began to travel the world and do lectures and training. And here I am in Switzerland in a product management conference. The gentleman on the left is Michael Eckert from the Chasm Group. I am second from the left. Marty Kagan from Silicon Valley Product Group in the United States on the West Coast, Stephen Haynes on the right from Sequent Learning in New York. And I believe that these three individuals, among others, were part of the subject matter consolidation stream. We all tried to explain product management. We did so differently, but we all tried to explain product management as a whole. And we all wrote books. I wrote my book, and Marty Kagan wrote his book, and Stephen Haynes wrote his book. And other people also wrote books on product management. But at the same time that myself and others were part of this subject matter consolidation approach, trying to explain product management, there was something happening in the United States. And initially, I was in Europe at the time, and I called it the West, Empire to the West. And I really meant America, but it was not just America, it was the West Coast. And it wasn't really the West Coast. It was specifically the companies and the people coming out of Silicon Valley. And that stream, which ran opposite in a contrarian fashion to the subject matter consolidation, is something that I labeled and named RRR marketing. Now, the circumstances are the same for the emergence of RRR marketing and subject matter consolidation. It was, again, 2001, the dot-com implosion, the high-tech sector recession, there were no jobs. And everybody was thinking, how can we do better? How can we develop software? How can we do product management better? And the thing is that RRR marketing, unlike subject matter consolidation, RRR marketing attempted to exploit the situation rather than resolve it. And I'll explain that. So I think perhaps some of you are familiar with Winston Churchill, who was the wartime leader in Britain during World War II, and he was quoted as saying, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." And RRR marketing did exactly that. It was an attempt to exploit the chaotic situation in product management rather than resolve it. So RRR marketing is an acronym that I made up for rename, rebrand, and reintroduce. And RRR marketing takes a pre-existing and established single one concept or idea and rebrands it and recasts it as something that is new and improved, some kind of a new theory, but later it's heavily commercialized. So RRR marketing, in essence, is an attempt to deal with one single aspect of product management and capitalize on it, but it doesn't try to deal with the product management domain holistically. So let's take a look at some examples. And these examples, I mean, RRR marketing started in product development and specifically in software development, and it permeated and kind of moved into product management later on. So in the 1960s, a certain approach to product management came about. It was called heavyweight software development, waterfall, stage gate, milestone-based. It's kind of a linear, bureaucratic, sequential approach to developing software. And at the same time that heavyweight software development came about, lightweight software development also was envisioned. And this was an approach that was more iterative and incremental. And somehow lightweight software development went out of favor and it disappeared for something like 30 years. And it reemerged in the 1990s. And without going into the history and everything, lightweight software development was rebranded as Agile software development, specifically in 2001. So they took lightweight software development principles and they did some modifications and they called it Agile. This was in 2001, and Agile was presented as the theory. And what you need is a method. Now, without, again, going into the history, the method that rose to the top and became most popular was something called Scrum. Scrum is a software development method that essentially is modeled after American football. Now, I know you all know it, but I got to go through the motions. So American football is a team sport with a ball where there are two teams who try to advance the ball in a series of steps, increments towards the end goal of the rival team, and you score points every time that you move an increment towards the end goal. So in football, it's called downs, and in Scrum, it's called sprints. And there's somebody on the field managing those downs, every effort that is trying to score points. Over there, it's called the quarterback. Here, it's called in Scrum, product owner. And there's somebody on the sidelines who understands the game and the rules and the spirit and kind of oversees that everybody is doing the right thing. In football, it's called the coach, and in Scrum, it's called the Scrum Master. Now, there's something in Scrum which is called the Coach's Handbook, and it's equivalent to something in American football, there's something called the Coach's Handbook, and it's equivalent to something in Scrum, which is called the Product Backlog. It's essentially a repository of everything and anything. Now, without going into the history, somebody said, we need to put something in the backlog. So what they did was they took the use case idea from the 1960s, and what they did was they kind of renamed, rebranded, they just decoupled a couple things over there, and they called it user stories. So now we have a situation where Agile and Scrum and user stories are extremely popular, and there are people making a lot of money from that. And there are people on the sideline looking at this, and they're telling themselves, I can also do that. I can also do this RRR marketing. So we have something, somebody came up and he took waterfall and another approach, which is called rational unified process. This was repackaged and relabeled as something called SAFE. And that's very good marketing because SAFE is a name that inspires confidence. It's not risk or something like that. And not only that, it's kind of leveraging the awareness to Agile in the market. And SAFE has also become extremely successful. Now, in the 80s, there was something called lean manufacturing by Toyota, and Silicon Valley is known for its startup. So now we have something called lean startup. But what they did over here is that they took market-driven product management and they rethought it, represented as a simplified, they did a simplified version, and they called it lean startup. Let's deviate just for a second. You'll see the context in a minute. We'll go to IBM and we'll come back to lean startup. So long ago, IBM had defined stages in software development, which many companies, by the way, around the world had later adopted. Generally speaking, software begins with an alpha version and continues to a beta product, a release candidate, and then released to manufacturing. Now, a beta product is a software product with a complete feature set that is ready for users to try out and comment on, to provide feedback. And that feedback is provided through a phase called beta testing. You gather actual information from the users about their needs, features, performance, bugs, anything that you could have. So what happened with the lean startup guys is that they took the IBM beta product and they presented it as something called MVP, minimum viable product. But essentially, if you analyze this more critically, the MVP is just a rename and rebranded term for what the software industry has known for decades as a beta product. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but we need to be aware that it's just the same thing presented differently. One of the more common terms that has been floating around lately is something called product-led growth, and there's all kinds of derivatives and variations of it. Now there's product-led strategy and product-led transformation. If you just dive deep inside to the definitions, then product-led growth is really what we've known for a very long time as shareware, which was the original term from the 1980s. Sampling, in-house app purchase, try it before you buy it. It's just the product kind of sells itself, but through the user experiencing it. Product market fit is another term that's been floating around for quite some time. It was always known as the problem solution space equilibrium, but now it's been recast and reimagined as product market fit. Feature factory is another term that's being promoted, but this is kind of interesting because here it's presented as a boogeyman. It's presented as a negative thing. What they did was they took technology-driven product management, which has its own advantages and disadvantages. They called it feature factory, and you can see all these terms over here: frustration, impatience. So they're casting it in a negative way and offering you a solution instead of that. But technology-driven product management is a viable way of doing product management. It's got its advantages and disadvantages, and it's correct and incorrect for certain scenarios. Another term that's come about in the last couple of years is the dual track product development, product discovery, product delivery, which is mostly associated with Agile. So what exactly happened over here? Well, the classic product delivery process was always like this. There's something called product planning, which is describing the problem, product definition, which is describing the solution, and product development, which is the work to build the solution. It all makes sense. There's a problem, a solution, and you build it. Well, what they did with this delivery discovery thing is, I have my own speculation about why they did it, but instead of 3 stages, now you have 2 stages. They took product planning and product definition, they aggregated that, and they called it product discovery, and product development was renamed to be product delivery. Now, why they did that, I have my own ideas, but this is beyond the scope of this presentation here. Now, perhaps you've heard also of this term, both in product development and in product management, empowered team or self-managing team. So it all starts in the 1950s in the United States, where a group of psychologists came up with this psychological concept called empowerment, in which people have more control, autonomy, self-determination, accountability over themselves, their lives, and their decisions. This idea from the 1950s and 60s moved in the 1970s to the business world. And then they started to talk in the business world about the empowered employee and empowered team. And in the 1970s, there's even a book from the 1990s, I think, about empowerment in business. And there were experiments done in General Foods Corporation in the United States during the 1970s and at the Volvo automobile manufacturing facility in Sweden. And they showed that decentralized decision-making and job enrichment can affect productivity and employee satisfaction. So the idea of self-managing and empowerment moved into software development, and it's also found in the Scrum Guide. But it also had moved into product management, and some people are talking about this. We need to remember that the whole idea of empowerment is in business is part of something called IO psychology, industrial and organizational psychology. It's not really related to product management. There's something in the range of around 10 to 14 different approaches to manage teams, and empowerment is just one of them in a sense. I've written an article about that. Product vision is a term that's been around for quite some time. It's also found in PMTK. The interesting thing is that now it's being redefined and renamed, or all kinds of new variations and interpretations are being given to product vision. Product vision is really derived from the corporate mission and the corporate vision. And it's a legitimate term, but there's now multitude definitions and interpretations. It's very confusing. Every time I do a Google search on it, I find a new definition. A new term that has cropped up is, and I don't know what this is product user fit, not product market fit. So it's going to be interesting to see what are they going to do with that. There's plenty more examples, but the common denominator among all these elements is that they all focus on one particular topic. They don't try to resolve the product management domain. They only focus on one idea or one particular topic. And that particular idea or topic is heavily commercialized. There's training, workshops, certification, consulting, seminars, conferences around one particular topic. So we're now in the summary, and there was initially confusion in the product management world during the 1980s and 90s because of that generalization approach, that you do everything and anything, the scope was endless, and there was no mechanism to understand what is in product management and what is not. The generalization approach was somehow like substituted by RRR marketing in the early 2000s, and the confusion that we had with the generalization approach was continued with RRR marketing. I think that the growing mass of contradictory and superficial RRR marketing information on product management is not helpful, and it's just confusing everybody. And I revert again to Mr. Randy Pausch, the professor of computer science from Carnegie Mellon. Fundamentals, fundamentals, fundamentals. We need to understand the fundamentals of product management first. Otherwise, all that fancy RRR marketing, renaming, rebranding thing is just not going to work, and it's not really that important. So the key lesson from this presentation is that we all need to initially focus on the universal principles of product management. We need to understand the fundamentals of product management. And we need to look for supported knowledge on product management, something with an argument, with a rationale that it is explained in a way that appeals to your common sense. We're not going to look for trends, opinions, and buzzwords, all of them or most of them coming out of the Silicon Valley. So hopefully after this presentation, you will not get fooled once or even twice by any RRR marketing attempts. If anybody has any comments or would like to communicate, send their thoughts, you can do that through the Blackblot website, or you can do it through my LinkedIn profile. I want to thank Catherine Chong for inviting me over to deliver this presentation, and I want to thank you all for listening in to this presentation. I hope you've gained some insights, unconventional ones at that, with regard to the state of the product management world, with regard to some of the terms and buzzwords which are floating around in the product management sphere. All of this so you can develop more critical thinking, and you'll be able to make better, more informed choices with regard to doing the work in product management and selecting the right jobs for yourself. So I think we have